What up, though? Some of what Etymology Online says regarding the meaning and origin of the word civil are relating to civil law or life, pertaining to the internal affairs of a state, relating to a society, pertaining to public life, relating to civil order, meaning not barbarous, civil. Law Dictionary at law.com defines civil as the part of the law that encompasses business, contracts, estates, domestic relations, accidents, negligence, and everything related to legal issues, statutes, and lawsuits that is not criminal law. Etymology Online says of civilized, to bring out of barbarism, introduce order, refine, and enlighten. Etymology Online says of barbarism, uncivilized or rude nature, ignorance, or want of culture, foreign speech. My earliest recollection of civil rights talk were in reference to MLK, stirred and simmered with civil rights movement, lunch counter sit-ins, water fountain integration, bus boycotts, equality and such, different complexioned children playing together and attending the same schools. The black and or African Americans, the blacks and or African Americans were the ones fighting for these civil rights. When were you introduced to civil rights? Or the notion that you had been deprived of civil rights? What do the words civil rights mean to you, if anything? Color of law. The appearance or semblance without the substance of legal right. Misuse of power possessed by virtue of state law and made possible only because wrongdoer is clothed with authority of state, is action taken under color of law. The appearance of a legal right. In U.S. law, the term color of denotes the mere semblance of legal right, the pretense or appearance of. Color of law refers to an appearance of legal power to act, but which may operate in violation of law. It is a crime for one or more persons using power given to him or her by a governmental agency, local, state, or federal, to willfully deprive or conspire to deprive another person of any right protected by the Constitution or laws of the United States. This is from Stanford University. The Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. Civil Rights Act of 1964, July 2nd, 1964. In a June 11th, 1963 speech broadcast live on national television and radio, President John F. Kennedy unveiled plans to pursue a comprehensive civil rights bill in Congress, stating, "This nation, for all its hopes and all it boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free." President Kennedy's radio TV address, 970. King congratulated Kennedy on his speech, calling it one of the most eloquent, profound, and unequivocal pleas for justice and the freedom of all men ever made by any president. King, June 11th, 1963 speech. The earlier Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first law addressing the legal rights of African Americans. I'll say this time. I'll probably say it again at some point. But remember, the term African American wasn't really a part of um, wasn't a part of the narrative in 1950s in the 1950s and things like that. People who look like the so-called blacks or the so-called African Americans of today, these people were not referred to as African Americans. I'll leave it up to you to figure out what your family was called. The census records is a good indicator of the labels that they were putting on you or your family. But um, I haven't personally seen any census records from 1950 and before that actually called Americans like you and I African Americans. I haven't seen that. Take that into consideration. These words mean a lot. At one point, I didn't think words meant really anything, but words mean a lot. They mean something. And the definition of words means something. Let's shake it. A. Philip Randolph and other civil rights leaders continued to press the major political parties and Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy to enact such legislation and to outlaw segregation. And to outlaw segregation. So they wanted to outlaw you making a decision to not interact with someone who you didn't want to interact with. In his January 4th, 1964 column in the New York Amsterdam News, King maintained that the legislation was the order of the day at the Great March on Washington last summer. The Negro and his compatriots for self-respect and human dignity will not be denied. This is what King said, a look to 1964. King said, the Negro, he mentioned you, American, as the Negro, okay? When we're talking about this civil rights legislation, we have to be cognizant of the labels that they give you as the American in that legislation and how you are referred to in that legislation. So just listen, he's calling you the Negro. So you would expect that in the legislation, in the Civil Rights Acts, there would be the mention of the Negro. Now, you can say, hey, well, it should mention African American. Well, I can almost guarantee that it doesn't mention African American. But the Negro, we would expect, if King is saying this, that that legislation would address the people who he's marching for. The bill passed the House of Representatives in mid-February 1964. When the bill finally passed the Senate, King hailed it as one that would bring practical relief to the Negro in the South and will give the Negro in the North a psychological boost that he sorely needs. King, June 19th, 1964. Me personally, I'm always skeptical of an individual who takes it upon themselves to think for, act on behalf of an entire group of people of which he doesn't know personally. So he doesn't know how they move in life. He don't know their story. He don't know where they come from, who they are, what they call themselves. When the bill finally passed the Senate, King hailed it as one that would bring practical relief to the Negro in the South and will give the Negro in the North a psychological boost that he sorely needs. June 19th, 1964. This is King. He's referring to the Negro. The Negro is who he's seeking out legislation to benefit. This is from the National Archives, Civil Rights Act, 1964. This act, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson on July 2nd, 1964, prohibited discrimination in public places, provided for the integration of schools and other public facilities, and made employment discrimination illegal. It was the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. In a nationally televised address on June 6, 1963, President John F. Kennedy urged the nation to take action toward guaranteeing equal treatment of every American, regardless of race. President Lyndon Johnson signed it into law just a few hours after it was passed by Congress on July 2nd, 1964. The act outlawed segregation in businesses such as theaters, restaurants, and hotels. It banned discriminatory practices in employment and ended segregation in public places such as swimming pools, libraries, and public schools. Was this the right thing to do? Was this the right thing to do? Guaranteeing equal treatment of every American regardless of race. How do you guarantee equal treatment of everyone? It doesn't seem natural to me that everyone would treat everyone else equally by law. The act outlawed segregation in businesses such as theaters, restaurants, and hotels. It banned discriminatory practices in employment and ended segregation in public places such as swimming pools, libraries, and public schools. What this makes me think of is when women were so-called allowed to enter the workforce, the corporate workforce, to start working for businesses, start laboring for someone else as opposed to their families at home. This reminds me of that. It's not so much about acquiescing to the pleas of the women who want to work. But to me, it speaks more to the big picture. Why have 50% of humans, of adult humans, not working? If we get the other half, we have the men working. If we get the women working, this is beneficial in terms of profit. This seems to be along those same lines. It seems that it would be more beneficial to control the population as a whole if we got people to get along, if people were forced to get along from an early age, starting with school. This is from www.archives.gov. Title 7, Equal Employment Opportunity Definitions. Section 701, for the purposes of this title. The term person includes one or more individuals, labor unions, partnerships, associations, corporations, legal representatives, mutual companies, joint stock companies, trusts, unincorporated organizations, trustees in bankruptcy, or receivers. So next time you call someone a person, you say this person, that person, hey person. You've used the term a million times. Understand that the term person includes one or more individuals, labor unions, partnerships, associations, corporations, legal representatives, mutual companies, joint stock companies, trusts, unincorporated organizations, trustees in bankruptcy, or receivers. The term employer means a person engaged in an industry affecting commerce who has 25 or more employees for each working day in each of 20 or more calendar weeks in the current or preceding calendar year, and any agent of such a person, but such term does not include the United States. The United States, a corporation wholly owned by the government of the United States. The United States, a corporation wholly owned by the government of the United States, an Indian tribe, or a state or political subdivision thereof. A bona fide private membership club other than a labor organization, which is exempt from taxation under Section 501C of the Internal Revenue Code of 1954, provided that during the first year after the effective date prescribed in subsection A of Section 716, persons having fewer than 100 employees and their agents shall not be considered employers. And during the second year after such date, persons having fewer than 75 employees and their agents shall not be considered employers. And during the third year after such date, persons having fewer than 50 employees and their agents shall not be considered employers. This is from the United States Senate, Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Senate and Civil Rights Acts and Civil Rights, 1862 to 1963. Passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 marked a milestone in the long struggle to extend civil, political, and legal rights and protections to who? African Americans, including former slaves and their descendants, and to end segregation in public and private facilities. The Senate played an integral part in this story. Again, remember, legal rights and protections to African Americans. So it seems that the civil rights, the marches, all these things were to ensure legal rights and protections to African Americans. So it should be no problem finding the term African Americans written into this legislation. Right? Right? First, I was thinking, hey, I would expect to see Negro in this legislation because that's the term that King used and that's what King was fighting for. But see, now when I read this, it says legal rights and protections to African Americans. I'm expecting to see the term African Americans within the legislation. Let's shake it. William Stewart of Nevada, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, guided the 15th Amendment through the Senate. Ratified February 3, 1870, the amendment prohibited states from disenfranchising voters on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These constitutional amendments granted legal status to African Americans. We should see African Americans in the legislation. In 1870, Sumner introduced the new Civil Rights Bill to provide African Americans with equal access to such public accommodations as churches, theaters, trains, ships, jury boxes, and most importantly, public schools. In 1870, Sumner introduced the new Civil Rights Bill to provide African Americans with equal access to such public accommodations as churches, theaters, trains, ships, jewelry boxes, and most importantly, public schools. So by reading this section, this selection right here, you would think that so-called African Americans didn't have access to these things. You would think that African Americans couldn't build their own churches, theaters, trains, ships, jewelry boxes, and public schools. That the so-called African American would have to depend on someone else to create these things for them. And it would make you think that they didn't already have these things. How many of you are familiar first with who they're referring to when they say African Americans? Because in 1870, no one was referred to as an African American. We know that in Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language in 1828, we know that Webster defined an American as, of course, one of the copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, or indigenous Americans, original Americans, people who were already here when early explorers came. But then they say the name American it now referred to, and this is in 1828, it now referred to the descendants of Europeans. Okay, let's take that. Let's say that when we talk about this right here in this selection, in 1870, Sumner introduced the new Civil Rights Bill to provide African Americans with equal access, blah, blah, blah. If we say that in 1870, if we look at 1828 Webster's Dictionary, American Dictionary of the English Language, and we go with that, and we say, okay, when we think of Americans, hey, it's the descendants of Europeans. And the story that we're given is that so-called blacks, so-called African Americans, we were, slaves. We were shackled, bound and shackled, chattel slavery. So let me ask, why would the so-called descendants of Europeans, the Americans, if they were the real Americans, why would they tack on Americans to the back of a description that was given to what we've been told they thought of as the filth under their shoes, which was the African slaves that were brought here by the tens of millions? Why would they tack on Americans on the back of the people who they thought of as less than human? Why? Just like when people, and I used to think like this at one point, when people like me, Americans, people who you term blacks or African Americans, when, we've said, oh, this is a slave master's name. The slave masters gave me their name. Yeah, they gave you their name, huh? They gave a person who they regarded as less than human, they gave you their last name. So when they made the transition, when they passed away, you could inherit what was theirs. Let's shake it. A month later, after years of delay and indifference to their own deceased colleague, the Senate Judiciary Committee approved Sumner's Civil Rights Bill. The Senate passed it in June. The House of Representatives concurred the following February. The President, Ulysses S. Grant, signed the bill into law in March of 1875. It ignored the issue of segregation in public schools. The Supreme Court ended even this limited victory in 1883 when it declared the law unconstitutional. Despite the legislation and constitutional amendments passed during the era of Reconstruction that extended federal protection to African Americans, many states, particularly in the South, enacted Jim Crow laws. I know, Jim Crow, ruffle your tail feathers or whatever. No pun intended. Listen, I'm gonna leave it to you to do a deep dive into the Jim Crow laws. As a matter of fact, don't stop there. Look up the etymology, or we don't have to go the etymology route. Look up what Jim Crow means. Look up who Jim Crow is and the reason they named laws after this human, Jim Crow. These state segregation laws, upheld by the Supreme Court's Plessy versus Ferguson 1896 decision, made the concept of equality elusive well into the 20th century, well into the 1900s. Civil rights activists launched a series of coordinated legal efforts to end Jim Crow, resulting in two significant Supreme Court decisions. In Brown versus Board of Education, 1952, the court found segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. A second decision in 1956, prompted by the actions of Rosa Parks and the subsequent boycott of Montgomery, Alabama public buses, found municipal and state bus segregation laws unconstitutional. Enforcement continued to prove difficult. One more thing to pay attention to is the years. Always pay attention to the years because they're important. When you hear 1954, 1956, this is literally seems like yesterday. And understand when they say Supreme Court decisions, and they mention these laws and these cases and this legislation, understand that your ancestors, your bloodline, your lineage, your people were a part of the Senate, were a part of Congress. You won't know that if you allow people to give you every thought. Congress passed additional legislation in 1960 to strengthen voting rights guarantees. It's always voting. That same year, North Carolina college students staged a sit-in at a lunch counter in a Greensboro department store that refused to serve them because of their race. August 1963, a coordinated march on Washington brought hundreds of thousands of Americans to the national Capitol to demand jobs and freedom. August 1963, a coordinated march on Washington brought hundreds of thousands of Americans, not blacks, not African Americans, not negroes, Americans. I'm starting to think it's meant to confuse you. Why mention Negroes? Why mention African Americans? And then say August 6, 1963, a coordinated march on Washington brought hundreds of thousands of Americans. We know who the people were when they did the March on Washington. You've seen clips, pictures, all that. You've heard recollections from people. We know who the people were who marched on Washington. We know it was a mixed bag. But hundreds of thousands of Americans following Kennedy to the national Capitol to demand jobs and freedom, to demand to be slaves. How do you don't have jobs and freedom. You have one or the other. Because if you got a job, if you have employment, if you are an employee, you are a laborer, a worker, or a slave. And if you are laboring, working, slaving for someone else, that means you're sacrificing your time/freedom for currency. So jobs and freedom don't go together. Following Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, President Lyndon Johnson proposed making civil rights legislation a national priority. Judiciary Committee Chairman Emanuel Seller of New York and Ranking Member William McCullough of Ohio revised the administration's bill. The House approved the measure with the roll call vote of 290 to 130 on February 10th, 1964. This is from Legal Information Institute. 28 CFR and 42.402 definitions. Civil Rights Act of 1964. These are definitions. And black. So, number one, black, not of Hispanic origin. A person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa. Any of the black racial groups of Africa. We all know there are 50 plus so-called countries. Let's for the sake of conversation, I don't want to get into Africa being connected with Europe and Asia and it all being one land mass. We know that, but for the sake of this conversation, we know there are 50 plus countries in Africa. We know that each of those countries have many different people and people who call themselves different things. Some groups call themselves the same things. Others call themselves different things. You won't know that unless you get to know someone. When you call a person African, that is probably as lazy as you can get. Because you know there are 50 plus countries, and within each of those countries, people have families. And they've been calling themselves something for centuries. And you don't know. How would you know? How could you know? How could anyone know unless you sat with those people and spoke with them? Hispanic, a person, but you call yourself black. You are black, not of Hispanic origin, a person having origins in any of the black racial groups in Africa. Hispanic, a person of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South American or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. A person of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central, or South American, or any other Spanish culture. First of all, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central, or South American, or other Spanish culture. These aren't Spanish culture. Some of these people speak Spanish. Spanish culture to me is Spain. It says regardless of race, regardless of complexion, regardless of these people are the people of those soil portions. Asian or Pacific Islander, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East. Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, or the Pacific Islands. This area includes, for example, China, Japan, Korea, the Philippine Islands, and Samoa. There is so many misnomers within this page alone. I'm going to move on. There's not enough time right now. I'm going to leave it to you to sort of go through and just dissect and just ponder on these labels that they're giving people and what they and how lazy they are and how much is lost within these things. American Indian or Alaskan Native. It's like American Indian or Alaskan Native, saying that basically these two things are the same. American Indian or Alaskan Native. And we know that not to be true. A person having origins in any of the original peoples of North America and who maintain cultural identification through tribal affiliation or community recognition. So a person having origins in any of the original peoples of North America, okay, that sounds good for American Indian, and who maintain cultural identification through tribal affiliation, this is where it excludes you. You identify as black. Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South American identify as Hispanic. So this eliminates you from the American Indian label, because not only do you not identify as that, but you don't have any tribal affiliation. And not that that's a good or a bad thing, but we all know that you have to do paperwork and all this other kind of stuff, and to get in these tribes, like getting into a mob or something. White, not of Hispanic origin. A person having origins in any of the original people of Europe, North Africa. Wait a minute. Black, not of Hispanic origin. A person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa. White, not of Hispanic origin. A person having origins in any of the original people of Europe, North Africa, or the Middle East. Let's move on. This is leaving. This is leaving the area of confusion and entering the area of pure disgust. Let's shake it. National Archives, 1968, a year of turmoil and change. 1968 was a turning point in U.S. history. The country lost two proponents of peace, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. The National Archives holds records documenting the turbulent time during 1968. State Historical Society of Iowa. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the 1968 Civil Rights Act, April 11th, 1968. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was a landmark law in the United States signed into law by United States President Lyndon B. Johnson, provided an avenue for equal housing opportunities regardless of race, creed, or national origin, and made it a federal crime to, by force or by threat of force, injure, intimidate, or interfere with anyone by reason of their race, color, religion, or national origin. Part of this act is commonly known as the Fair Housing Act and was meant as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, here we have the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Public Law 90 through 284, 82 Stat 73. So this is the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Look, by my estimation, we should be seeing the words African American. We should be seeing the word Negro in this legislation, in this act. Because if we see these two words, that means this act was made on our behalf, right? Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that this act may be cited as the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Title I, Interference with Federally Protected Activities. Section 201, Title II, Rights of Indians. This is Section 204, Applicability. Nothing in this section, A, creates or eliminates any federal or state criminal jurisdiction over Indian country, or affects the authority of the United States or any state government that has been delegated authority by the United States to investigate and prosecute a criminal violation in Indian country. Section 204, grants to tribal governments. The Attorney General may award grants to the governments of Indian tribes or to authorized designees of those governments. Section 204, authorization appropriations. There are authorized to be appropriated $5 million for each of fiscal years 2014 through 2018 to carry out subsection F and to provide training, technical assistance, data collection, and evaluation of the criminal justice systems of participating tribes. Section 204, participating tribe. The term participating tribe means an Indian tribe that elects to exercise special tribal criminal jurisdiction over the Indian country of that Indian tribe. Section 301. In general, there is authorized to be appropriated $25 million for each of fiscal years 2023 through 2027, A, to carry out subsection H, and B, to provide training, technical assistance, data collection, and evaluation of the criminal justice systems of participating tribes. Title III, Model Code Governing Courts of Indian Offenses. Section 301. The Secretary of the Interior is authorized and directed to recommend to Congress on or before July 1st, 1968, a model code to govern the administration of justice by courts of Indian offenses on Indian reservations. Such code shall include provisions which will, 1, assure that any individual being tried for an offense by a court of Indian offenses shall have the same rights, privileges, and immunities under the United States Constitution as would be guaranteed any citizen of the United States being tried in a federal court for any similar offenses. Assure that any individual being tried for any offense by a court of Indian offenses will be advised and made aware of his rights under the United States Constitution and under any tribal constitution applicable to such individual. Establish proper qualifications for the office of judge of the Court of Indian Offenses, and provide for the establishing of educational classes for the training of judges of courts of Indian offenses. In carrying out the provisions of this title, the Secretary of the Interior shall consult with the Indians, Indian tribes, and interested agencies of the United States. This is Section 401, Title IV, Jurisdiction over Criminal and Civil Actions. Nothing in this section shall authorize the alienation, in encumbrance, or taxation of any real or personal property, including water rights belonging to any Indian or any Indian tribe, band, or community that is held in trust by the United States or is subject to a restriction against alienation imposed by the United States, or shall authorize regulation of the use of such property in a manner inconsistent with any federal treaty, agreement, or statute, or with any regulation made pursuant thereto, or shall deprive any Indian or any Indian tribe, band, or community of any right, privilege, or immunity afforded under federal treaty, agreement, or statute. Section 402, with respect to hunting, trapping, or fishing, or the control, licensing, or regulation thereof. Assumption by state of civil jurisdiction. Section 402. The consent of the United States is hereby given to any state not having jurisdiction over civil causes of action between Indians or to which Indians are parties which arise in the areas of Indian country situated within such state to assume with the consent of the tribe occupying the particular Indian country or part thereof which would be affected by such assumption, such measure of jurisdiction over any or all such civil cases, civil causes of action arising within such Indian country or any part thereof as may be determined by such state to the same extent that such state has jurisdiction over other civil causes of action, and those civil laws of such state that are of general application to private persons or private property shall have the same force and effect within such Indian country or part thereof as they have elsewhere within that state. Section 501, special election. Section 406, state jurisdiction acquired pursuant to this title with respect to criminal offenses or civil causes of action, or with respect to both, shall be applicable in Indian country only where the enrolled Indians within the affected area of such Indian country accept such jurisdiction by a majority vote of the adult Indians voting at a special election held for that purpose. The Secretary of the Interior shall call such special election under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe, when requested to do so by the tribal council or other governing body, or by 20 per centum of such enrolled adults. 25 USC 1326. Section 601, Title 6, Employment of Legal Counsel, Approval. Section 601, notwithstanding any other provision of law, if any applicable, if any application made by an Indian tribe, Indian council, or any band or group of Indians under any law requiring the approval of the Secretary of the Interior or the Commissioner of Indian Affairs of contracts or agreements relating to the employment of legal counsel, including the choice of counsel and the fixing of fees by any such Indians, tribe, council, band, or group, is neither granted nor denied within 90 days following the making of such application. Such approval shall be deemed to have been granted. 25 USC 1331. 25, I'm thinking USC means United States Code. Title 7, Materials relating to constitutional rights of Indians. Secretary of the Interior to prepare. Section 701. In order that the constitutional rights of Indians might be fully protected, the Secretary of the Interior is authorized and directed to Title 8, Fair Housing. Section 800, this title may be cited as the Fair Housing Act. Section 801, it is a policy of the United States to provide within constitutional limitations for fair housing throughout the United States. 42 USC 3601. Definitions. Section 802. As used in this title, Secretary means the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Dwelling means any building, structure, or portion thereof which is occupied as or designed or intended for occupancy as a residence by one or more families, and any vacant land which is offered for sale or lease for the construction or location thereon of any such building, structure, or portion thereof. Family includes a single individual. Person includes one or more individuals, corporations, partnerships, associations, labor organizations, legal representatives, Mutual companies, joint stock companies, trusts, unincorporated organizations, trustees in case under Title 11 of the United States Code, receivers, and fiduciaries. State means any of the several states, the District of Columbia, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or any of the territories and possessions of the United States. So, moving right along to Coastal Carolina Indian Center. 1790 Coastal Carolina Indian Cross Reference Database, December 4th, 2011. This is a 1790 Coastal Carolina Indian Cross Reference Database. Free people of color by county, 1790 Federal Census. A cross-reference using surnames, known names of Indian families, and historic Indian villages. In researching Indian ancestry, it's important to note that for a variety of reasons in history, usually economic or socio-political, Indian people were often recorded as sometimes white, other times black or Negro, and other times free person of color, colored, or mulatto. Remember, we just went over the 1968 Civil Rights Act, and I don't know if you were paying attention. I was. Did you hear the word Negro once? Did you hear the term African American once? Who was King talking about when he was fighting for civil rights? Who was he fighting for civil rights for? And when you figure out who he was fighting for, who are those people? More importantly, who are you? Let's shake it. Duke University Library. Digitized by the Internet Archive in 2007 with funding from Duke University Libraries. The Aboriginal Races of North America. You can read the rest by Professor H.L. Williams. Let's do it. The Original Races of North America, comprising biographical sketches of eminent individuals and an historical account of the different tribes from the first discovery of the continent to the present period, with the dissertation on them. Origin, antiquities, manners, and customs, illustrative narratives and anecdotes, and a copious analytical index by Samuel G. Drake, 15th edition, revised with valuable additions by Professor H.L. Williams. New York, Hearst and Company Publishers. Biography and History of the Indians of North America. Book 1. The Indians, the people who were actually in the 1968 Civil Rights Act. The only name I read in that, I didn't read any Negro, any African Americans, any blacks, any Puerto Ricans, any Mexicans, any of this stuff. All I read was Indians. Book 1, Origin, Antiquities, Manners, and Customs of the American Indians. Chapter 1. The name Indian was erroneously applied to the original man of America by its first discoverers. It is true that it matters but little to us by what name the indigenous of a country are known, and especially those of America, in as far as as the name is seldom used among us, but in application to the Aboriginal Americans. Book 2, Biography and History of the Northern or New England Indians. Chapter 1. In the first voyage of Columbus to America, he took along with him, he took along, took along with him on his return to Spain a considerable number of Indians. How many we do not know, but several died on their passage, and 7 were presented to the king. Vicente Yanes Pinzon, a captain under Columbus, kidnapped 4 natives. See how they throw that in? Whom he intended to sell in Spain for slaves. Okay. This is the first voyage of Columbus. We're talking about American Indians, which here is synonymous with natives. These words will confuse you. Put them into perspective because words have meanings. A captain under Columbus kidnapped 4 natives. He kidnapped. So one hand they saying they took along, Columbus took along quite a few Indians with him. And then he's saying that Columbus's captain kidnapped 4 natives whom he intended to sell in Spain for slaves. There were 3 natives presented to Henry VII by Sebastian Cabot in 1502, which he had taken from Newfoundland. What were their names or what became of them? We are not informed. But from the notice of historians, we learn that when found, they were clothed with the skins of beasts and lived on raw flesh. But after 2 years' residence in England, were seen in the king's court clothed like Englishmen, and could not be discerned from Englishmen. They could not be discerned from Englishmen. They dressed like them, and you couldn't tell them apart. So, did the Englishmen look like them, or did they look like the Englishmen, complexion-wise? These were the first Indians ever seen in England. The Indians that, came over with Columbus and Cabot. Oh, the Indians that Columbus brought with him. The Indians from America. Remember, Indian at that time was synonymous with America. And let the early explorers tell it. This is Columbus presenting the king and queen of Spain with the Americans. Were brought to the English court in their country habit, and spoke a language never heard before out of their own country. In 1620, some determined white people with the most astonishing and invincible firmness undertook to wander 3,000 miles from the land of their birth, and in the most hazardous manner to take up a permanent abode upon the borders of a boundless wilderness, a wilderness as great as far greater for aught they knew than the expanse of ocean which they were to pass. Expanse of ocean that they were to pass. But all dangers and difficulties there to be encountered weighed nothing in comparison with the liberty of conscience which they might enjoy when once beyond the control of their bigoted persecutors. Bigoted persecutors. So these determined white people, coming from 3,000 miles away to America, were moving beyond the control of their bigoted persecutors. These singular people had liberty from their oppressor, James I, to go and settle in this wilderness being America, and to possess themselves of some of the lands of the Indians. So they're trying to get beyond the control of their bigoted persecutors to come here and possess themselves of some of the lands of the Indians, provided they paid him or some of his friends for them. No one seems then to have questioned how this king came by the right and title to lands here, any more than how he came by his crown. They were less scrupulous, perhaps, in this matter, as the king told them in a charter which he granted them, though not till after they had sailed for America. After numerous delays and disappointments, the Pilgrims, to the number of 41, with their wives, children, and servants, sailed from Plymouth in England in one small ship called the Mayflower on Wednesday, the 6th of September. Their passage was attended with great peril, but they safely arrived at Cape Cod, November 9th, following without the loss of any of their number, which was 41. They now proceeded to make the necessary discoveries to seat themselves on the barren coast. One of the first things they found necessary to do to preserve order among them was to form a kind of constitution or general outline of government. No. See, these people came, they were 41 of these people. And it says the first thing they did when they got up on the coast is they had to form some type of government. Basically, they had to, appoint, hey, who's in control? You in control of this? You in control of this? You in control of this? We're in control of this. Okay, to have some type of order. We don't want everybody to go for themselves. We don't want everyone to go for themselves. We don't want people to start getting scared, start feeling desperate, because we have to build a life here. And if everyone's moving on their own accord or according to their own constitution, it'll never work. Having done this, it was signed by the 41. 2 days after their arrival, November 11th, the same day, 15 or 16 of their number, covered with armor, proceeded to the land and commenced discoveries. The word discover just means to see something. If I discover this piece of paper, that means I see this piece of paper, or I saw that piece of paper. The Indians did not show themselves to the English until the 15th. And then they would have nothing to say to them. About 5 or 6 at first only appeared, who fled into the woods as soon as they had discovered themselves. The Englishmen followed them many miles, but could not overtake them. They followed them many miles, but could not overtake them. Why were they trying to overtake them? Maybe I'm misinterpreting the word overtake. Maybe it just means catch up with them. Okay. The 11th of December, ever memorable in the history of New England, was now come, and this was the day of the landing of the Pilgrims. The 11th day of December. The 11th day of December. A place upon the inhospitable shore had been fixed upon, and was this day taken possession of, and never again deserted. The ship until then had been their permanent abode, which now they gladly exchanged for the sandy shores of the Bay of Cape Cod. Welcome, Englishmen, welcome, Englishmen, are words so inseparably associated with the name of Somerset, that we can never hear the one without the pleasing recollection of the other. These were the first accents our pilgrim fathers heard on the American strand from any native. Welcome, Englishmen. Welcome, Englishmen. The first accents our pilgrim fathers heard on the American strand from any native. We mean intelligible accents, for when they were attacked at Namskeket on their first arrival, they heard only the frightful war whoop. The first time Indians were seen by the pilgrims was upon the 15th of November, 1620. They espied 5 or 6 people with a dog coming toward them who were savages, who, when they saw them, ran into the wood and whistled the dog after them. So the Indians had a dog. And though the English ran toward them, when the Indians perceived when the Indians perceived it, they ran away, might and main, and the English could not come near them. Soon after this, Morton says the Indians got all the powwows in the country, who, for 3 days together, in a horrid and devilish manner, did curse and execrate them with their conjurations. Which assembly and service they held in a dark and dismal swamp. Behold how Satan labored to hinder the gospel from coming into New England. So the English said, behold how Satan labored to hinder the gospel from coming into New England. So they thought that anyone opposed to speaking with them, being influenced by them, being indoctrinated by them, being programmed by them, it was a work of Satan making that happen, preventing that connection. But more importantly, the first time Indians were seen by the pilgrims was upon 15th of November, 1620. 1620 is an interesting year because you've all heard of the 1619 project when the 20 and odd Africans supposedly first were brought to America. Was in 1619. We'll get into that some other time. I've already got into it. You can go look at some of my previous shows. I talk extensively about 1619. It's a misnomer, that whole African thing, as we just saw in the 1968 Civil Rights Act. You didn't see anything about any African American. You didn't see anything about any Negro. The first time Indians were seen by the pilgrims, November 15th, 1620. So this is the first time they brought the 20 and odd Africans here, was in 1619. And then the first time the Englishmen saw Indians was 1620. Coincidence? You be the judge of that. These first went to Block Island, where they saw a few Indians before they landed, who, after shooting a few arrows, which wounded 2 of the English, fled. The Indians had here 2 plantations 3 miles in sunder and about 60 wigwams, some very large and fair, and above 200 acres of corn. These first went to Block Island, where they saw a few Indians before they landed, who, after shooting a few arrows which wounded two of the English, fled. The Indians had here 2 plantations 3 miles in sunder and about 60 wigwams, some very large and fair, and other and above 200 acres of corn. We always see the corn associated with the American Indians. And I just want to ask, look, none of this is to prove anything. My intentions are not to prove anything. We're learning together. We're discovering together. But one question: who eat cornbread? Who eat corn? Who eat the most corn? Who bred they fish with corn? Who use corn for grits? I know. Native Americans. When have you ever saw a Native American bread anything with corn or use corn for anything? When have you ever been to a Native American restaurant? Again, who used corn? And this wigwam, the Indians had here 2 plantations. 2 plantations. Who did you associate with the plantations? We're not even talking about once the so-called white people got here and were settled in. No, they didn't settle in yet. They trying to figure out, who gonna be in control of what. The Indians had here 2 plantations 3 miles in sunder and about 60 wigwams, some very large and fair, and above 200 acres of corn. 1828, Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language, wigwam, an Indian cabin or hut, so called in America. It is sometimes written wigwam. It's an Indian cabin or hut. It's not a teepee. Where did the teepee come from? Well, go look into teepees and Eastern Europe. Wigwam, an Indian cabin or hut, so called in America. It is sometimes written wigwam. Etymology Online, the etymology of words. Etym Online, wigwam from the 1620s. We're talking about the year 1620. Okay, it's perfect. 1620s from Algonquin, probably Eastern Abenaki. Wigwam, a dwelling, said to mean literally their house. So a wigwam is they crib, they house, they spot, they flat. Also said to be found in such formations as Wigwam or Ojibwa, Wigwam, and Delaware, Wigwam. So somebody house, somebody spot. Book 4, Biography and History of the Southern Indians. We are aware that some writers suppose that all the Indians from the Mississippi to the vicinity of the Hudson and even to the Connecticut were originally of the same stock. 2 days after, Powhatan, having disguised himself in the most fearfulest manner he could, caused Captain Smith to be brought forth to a great house in the woods, and there upon a mat by the fire to be left alone. Not long after, from behind a mat that divided the house was made the most dolefulest noise he ever heard. Then Powhatan, more like a devil than a man, with some 200 more, as black as himself, came unto him and told him, now they were friends, and presently he should go to Jamestown to send him 2 great guns and a grindstone, for which he would give him the country of Capahowissick, and forever esteem him his son, Nanticoke. So to Jamestown, with 12 guides, Powhatan sent him. Chapter 3. The Creek Indians take their name from that of the country in which they live. That is, the English gave them the name of Creeks because their country is full of creeks. Beside the Muskogees, the Catawbas, Cherokees, Choctaws, and Chickasaws were other numerous tribes spread over the great country of which we had spoken. The Catawbas and the Chickasaws were very warlike, but their vicinity to Europeans was as detrimental to them, and even more so than their own exterminating wars. For, as in other cases, as soon as an intercourse commenced, degradation and ruin followed. The Cherokees have withstood the deleterious effects of civilization much beyond what can be said of any other tribe of Indians. Their country is chiefly in Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. The Cherokees' country is chiefly in Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and they have withstood the deleterious effects of civilization much beyond what can be said of any other tribe of Indians. That's why when you keep hearing your people, yeah, my family got Cherokee, my great grandmother had Cherokee and it was Cherokee. Yeah, y'all say that. Y'all say y'all great grandparents and grandparents and second greats had Cherokee in them, and then you call yourself black. No, if they was Cherokee, what do you think you are? These people resisted the effects of civilization much more than any other tribes of Indians, is what's said. The Cherokees, their country is chiefly Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, but they occupy also the western part of the state of Georgia. Before the War of 1812, their country covered 24,000 square miles. Numbers of this tribe have immigrated to Arkansas. The Choctaws possessed the country not so filled with creeks and rivers as the Muskogees. The circumstance, it is said, with the great hindrance to their prosperity, for in their wars with their neighbors they suffered greatly from their ignorance of swimming. There were upper and lower Choctaw towns. The former were situated about 160 miles from the Chickasaws, and the latter about 200 above New Orleans. The people of this nation flattened their heads by wearing bags of sand on them. And according to Father Hennepin, the heads of all the Indians up on the Mississippi are flatter than those of Canada. We can take this to mean that they flattened their heads. We can take this to mean that they did something that to me don't make any sense, which is that they put something on top of their head and their actual skull flattened, which to me is it doesn't even make sense to me. It would have meant that all these people were bald-headed, so that the writer or the explorer, the person who's describing it, if all of their heads are bald, then they could see the actual shape of their head. Or they were like a bunch of Americans today with the kid and play, high top fade, or box haircut. I don't know. You have to dig into that. It is said that it is said also that they are of a lighter complexion. But this has reference only to the Muskogees, according to some writers. The Choctaws principally inhabit Mississippi. They were in 1820 set down at 25,000 souls and are rather increasing. Now, this doesn't mean it wasn't more than 25,000. This just means that the people who these people came in contact with in order to describe someone. It's like me going outside right now and walking for 3 miles and looking at all the Americans that I come in contact with, all the so-called blacks or African Americans that I see, and I describe them. Sure, I'm describing a variety of people, but I'm only describing the people within a 2-mile radius. Within 2 miles. The Chickasaws reside in Mississippi, Kentucky, and Tennessee. They do not exceed 4,900 in number, so they think. The Seminoles were a nation made up similar to many others, and chiefly of Muskogees. The Creeks called themselves Seminoles, which signified Willa, because they had estranged themselves from their former country. A Negro spy who had been sent among the hostile Indians from Camp Izard soon after returned and confirmed the peaceable intentions of the chiefs. A Negro spy who had been sent among the hostile Indians. He was sent among them. They couldn't tell him from themselves. He looked like them. Who is a Negro? About the time General Gaines left Fort Drane, General Scott arrived there with instructions to assume the chief command of the forces in Florida. Since that time, the operations have been of not much importance. About the 20th of March, Captain Hitchcock communicated the following valuable information respecting the hostile Indians, which was given him by the friendly chief, Black Dirt, whose Indian name is Tuckaluster Harjo. He says that in the fights with General Gaines were the following chiefs and warriors: Jumper with 30, Ashwola or Osceola with 7, Albert Haro with 30, Jaharto Chi with 30, Char Tanusk Mekosuki with 470, Mekanop Principal Chief with 80, Abram Negro with 80, Wea Flacco Matez with 70, Yarhar Hakro with 160, Toskisar with 50, Echua Matez with 50, Hat How Imatez with 30, Charles Negro with 3, Koharjo with 1, and Toperlagi with 40. Chapter 12. The Creek Toe and tribes which have declared themselves hostile are a part of the Ochis, the Hichitas, the Palochocolos, and Sowokolos, and a part of the Ufales. Many friendly Indians immediately joined the whites, one of the principal leaders of whom is a chief called Jim Boy. Jim Boy. What kind of human being comes to mind when you hear the word Jim Boy, not the Tonto too long braids. On the 1st of July, Jim Henry fell into the hands of a band of friendly Indians under a chief named Jim Boy. I said John Boy is really Jim Boy. Jim Boy, for a few days previous, he was supposed to have been on his way for the promised land, but he was found in the Creek Nation a few miles from Tuskegee. And the etymology of Tuskegee means warrior. I have relatives from Tuskegee. Chapter 13. The situation of the Cherokee country is most delightful. It is everything that the heart could wish, whether actuated by the best or worst of motives. It lies in about 35 degrees of northern latitude, bounded north and west by Tennessee, on the south by Alabama, and easterly by Georgia, and North Carolina, comprising about 8,000 square miles. In 1802, it contained 11,175. The differences have been sold to the United States for the use of Georgia. That country is well watered by living springs in every part, whose fountains are like reservoirs raised to a great height by the art of man, they having the superior advantage of being natural reservoirs raised by springs in their lofty range of mountains which stretch across the whole nation. In the north it is hilly, but in the south are numerous fertile plains, in part covered with tall trees through which beautiful streams of water glide. Here cattle in vast herds roam, and horses are plenty, and in all the ordinary rises among the Indians, in all the ordinary uses among the Indians. Flocks of sheep, goats, and swine live on the slopes of the hills. On their navigable rivers, the Cherokees have vessels engaged in commerce. Their spring opens in great beauty. The soil is excellent for corn, cotton, tobacco, wheat, oats, indigo, sweet and Irish potatoes. And the people had, in 1825, begun to export cotton to New Orleans in their own vessels. In 1825, the people had began to export cotton to New Orleans in their own vessels. King Cotton. What do you know about cotton? What does the word cotton make you think of? It immediately makes you get scared. It immediately makes you get angry. It immediately strikes emotion. Because you didn't know that your family was growing cotton. Who else gonna pick it? They have public roads and taverns with good accommodations, and butter and cheese are common upon the ordinary tables of the Indian inhabitants. They living, man. They living. What did you think? Neat and flourishing villages have already sprung into being. Cotton and woolen clothes are manufactured by native Indian hands. There is scarcely a family which does not raise cotton sufficient for its own use. Their trade is almost wholly carried on by native Cherokees. The mechanic arts are considerably cultivated, although agriculture chiefly engages the attention of the inhabitants. In 1819, there were about 10,000 inhabitants, and in 1825, they had increased to 13,000, all natives. There were, in addition, 147 white men married to the nation and 73 white women. Of slaves, there were 1,277. Hence, it is plain that the Cherokees do not decrease, but have, in about 5 years, increased over 3,500. Again, as much as this person discovers, as much as they can see, this is equal at least to the increase of white population under similar circumstances. By the laws of the nation, the whites are allowed the privileges of natives except that of suffrage, together with their ineligibility to hold offices. They have offices to hold. Some of the Cherokees, following the example of the southern neighbors, have become slaveholders, buying their negroes of white men who bring them unto the nation, have become slaveholders, buying their negroes of white men who bring them into the nation. Take a minute to read that and figure out what that means. The word placement, everything. And here the reflection naturally arises in the inquiry upon the relative barbarity of the white and red men. And here the reflection naturally arises in the inquiry upon the relative barbarity of the white and red men. It was strongly argued by some Southern statesmen that the Indians were such barbarous wretches that they could not think of living beside them. And yet poor Africans are sold by them to these barbarians. But unlike the whites in one particular, they will not mix with their slaves. Let's shake it. A brief history of the Blackfeet Indians. The Blackfeet originally inhabited that region of country watered by the Saskatchewan and its tributaries, never extending their war parties farther south than the headwaters of the Marias River, or farther east than the headwaters of the Milk River, a tributary of the Missouri, into which it empties about 150 miles above the Yellowstone River. The cause of their separation and dispersion over a wider range of country grew out of a civil war regarding the claims of two ambitious chiefs, each claiming sovereign powers and each having different colored banners or flags, the one red, the other black. The warriors, being divided, enrolled themselves under the two banners, and after many skirmishes and assassinations, a pitched battle ensued, which resulted in the disastrous defeat of the black chief, of the black chief, of the black chief. Man. Two ambitious chiefs, each claiming sovereign powers and each having different colored banners or flags. The one red, the other one black. Two chiefs, they got their flags. They both represent a flag. These the Blackfeet Indians. Who y'all know today? Which two groups today each got their own colored flag? And then branch off and go to different cities. Where the different mobs in different cities, they all had their own flags. Why? Do they know this? Are they familiar with what I'm reading right now? Or is it in the very fabric of the flag they hold? This is whether good or bad. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the flag that they hold. The warriors, being divided, enrolled themselves under the two banners, and after many skirmishes and assassinations, a pitched battle ensued, which resulted in the disastrous defeat of the black chief. The original tribe is now divided into three bands: the Blood Indians, Blackfeet, and Piegans. The Blood Indians still remain in the north, though a portion of them make an annual visit to their relatives on the Missouri when their friendly feelings are such as to justify it. The Piegans formed a treaty of alliance with and friendship with the Flatheads, which, with few interruptions, has been kept in good faith up to the present time. The section of the country that many now be considered as claimed and occupied by the three bands, generally known as the Blackfeet Nation, extends from the waters of the Hudson Bay south to the headwaters of the Missouri River and to the northern sources of the Yellowstone River. The Blackfoot has always been regarded as a treacherous, bloodthirsty savage. But this is a mistake, growing out of ignorance of his true character. It is true, they killed and scalped a great many of the mountain trappers, but they found them trespassing on their hunting grounds and killing off the game upon which they relied for subsistence. And any other tribe or even civilized nation would have retaliated for much less cause of provocation. Those who have long resided among them have always found them frank, generous, and hospitable, ready at all times to repay any kindness they might receive from the whites. The Heritage Foundation. What the Constitution really says about race and slavery. December 2015. David Azarette, PhD. This is 1865. 150 years ago this month, 1865 is about 150 years ago. This month, the 13th Amendment officially was ratified, and with it, slavery finally was abolished in America. Was it? The New York World hailed it as one of the most important reforms ever accomplished by voluntary human agency. With the passage of the 13th Amendment, which states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Look, I'm not going to get into slavery, the word slavery, or the term involuntary servitude. I'm not going to get into it. I've already went over these terms in previous shows. So please go to my channel, Central Park Boogie. Go through the shows, check them out. Yeah, words have meanings, and these words have meanings. Textbooks and now again, remember, we went through the 1968 Civil Rights Act. We did not see the word Negroes. We did not see the word African Americans, but we do know MLK fought long and hard, march on Washington in order so that that act would benefit people who we term blacks and African Americans, but we didn't see any of those terms in that Civil Rights Act. I wonder why. Well, we don't have to wonder. We know which term we saw. And we know that Martin Luther King was a educated man. We know he read. We know he knew what was in that act. He was there. Textbooks and history books routinely dismiss the Constitution as racist and pro-slavery. The New York Times, among others, continues to casually assert that the Constitution affirmed African Americans to be worth only 3/5 of a human being. Now, wait. First, we were talking about the 1968 Civil Rights Act. Now we're talking about the Constitution, and we're using this term African Americans. Okay, let's see. So, this is the Annenberg Guide to the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 2. We're going to be looking at where it says right here, the New York Times, among others. And when they say among others, that means you. Yeah, that means you. That means you, your African American studies teacher. It means you. The New York Times and yo ass continue to casually assert that the Constitution affirmed African Americans to be worth only 3/5 of a human being. We all heard the 3/5 thing. All of us. And all of us think that's what the Constitution says, which means none of us read. Until now. Article 1, Section 2, representatives and direct, and you can go to the Constitution and look this up too. Article 1, Section 2, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed. Listen. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, free people with a job for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed. So the number of persons, the people who got a job for a number of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all persons. Where does it say anything about a black? Where does it say anything about an African American in the Constitution? Let's shake it. We're back to the Heritage Foundation. Many Americans who are resolutely opposed to racism unwittingly agree with Chief Justice Roger Taney's claim in Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857, that the founders' Constitution regarded blacks as so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro, look at these words, this is disgusting. We're bombarded with illusions, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. In this view, the worst Supreme Court case decision in American history was actually correctly decided. The argument that the Constitution is racist suffers from one fatal flaw. The concept of race does not exist in the Constitution. Such arguments have unsettling implications. They teach citizens to despise their founding charter and to be ashamed of their country's origins. And they foster alienation and resentment among African American citizens by excluding them from our Constitution. And they foster alienation and resentment among African American citizens. Who is the African American? The African American does not exist. Wait, correction. Let's see. This is by Etym Online, the etymology of words online. So we just saw black and we saw African American. So Old English Blake, absolutely dark, absorbing all light, of the color of soot or coal. From Proto-Germanic black is burned. Source of Old North, black or dark. Old High German blah, black. Swedish black, ink. Dutch blacken, to burn. From Pi bleg, to burn, gleam, shine, flash. Also of Greek phlegon, to burn. Scorch, Latin flagrare, to blaze, glow, burn. From root bale, to shine, flash, burn. The usual Old English word for black was swart, swarty. The same root produced Middle English Blake, pale. The same root produced Middle English Blake, pale. From Old English black, bright, shining, glittering, pale. The connecting notion between perhaps fire, bright, and burned, dark, or perhaps absence of color. According to OED, Oxford, in Middle English, it is often doubtful whether black, Blake, black means black, dark, or pale, colorless, wan, livid. And the surname Blake can mean either one of pale complexion or one of dark complexion. Black was used of dark-skinned people in Old English, of coffee with nothing added, attested by 1796. And if you go get coffee and you don't add nothing to it and you pour it, you'll see that it's really, really, really dark brown. Attested by 1796, the meaning fierce, terrible, wicked is from late 14th century, late 1300s. The figurative senses often come from the notion of without light, moral or spiritual. Latin niger. I'm gonna just say niger. You know what I mean? I want to say how it really sound, but they try to romanticize it. Latin niger had many of the same figurative senses: gloomy, unlucky, bad, wicked, malicious. The metaphoric use of the Greek word melas, however, tended to reflect the notion of shrouded in darkness, overcast. In English, it has been the color of sin and sorrow at least since the 1300s. The sense of with dark purposes, malignant, emerged 1580s in black art, necromancy. It is also the sense in black magic. This is Etymology Online, Etym Online, the etymology of words, the online version. African American. There are isolated instances from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Isolated, but the modern use is a reinvention first attested 1969 in reference to the African American Teachers Association, which became the preferred term in some circles for U.S. black. Noun or adjective by the late 1980s. See African plus American. Mention 1921 reports Afro-American is now very commonly used in the Negro press. Afro-American is attested in 1853 in Freeman's publications in Canada. Africo-American, 1817 as a noun, 1826 as an adjective, was common in abolitionist and colonization society writings. They was already planning and plotting. Yikes. Okay, let's return to the Heritage Foundation. Now that we've cleared up the black and African American, if we turn to the actual text of the Constitution and the debates that gave rise to it, a different picture emerges. The case for a racist pro-slavery constitution collapses under closer scrutiny. The argument that the Constitution is racist suffered from one fatal flaw. The concept of race does not exist in the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution or in the Declaration of Independence, for that matter, are human beings classified according to race, skin color, or ethnicity, nor, one should add, sex, religion, or any other of the left's favorite groupings. The Constitution speaks of people, citizens, persons, other persons, and Indians not taxed, in which case it is their tax exempt status and not their skin color that matters. Tax exempt status. Why do they have a tax exempt status? That's what you should be trying to figure out, because obviously who King was talking about in the 1968 Civil Rights Act were Indians. And when he says Indians, what people is he talking about? The Constitution speaks of people, citizens, persons, other persons, and Indians not taxed, in which case it is their tax exempt status and not their skin color that matters. The first reference to race and color occur in the 15th Amendment's guarantee of the right to vote, ratified in 1870. The infamous 3/5 clause, which more nonsense has been written than any other clause, does not declare that a black person is worth 60% of a white person. It says that for purposes of determining the number of representatives for each state in the House and direct taxes, the government would count only 3/5 of the slaves and not all of them, as the southern states who wanted to gain more seats had insisted. Now, this article, theheritagefoundation.org, he says 3/5 of the slaves. Let's see. Again. Let's see. He says 3/5. Let's make sure. Let's make sure that's what he said. It says that for purposes of determining the number of representatives for each state in the House and direct taxes, the government would count only 3/5 of the slaves and not all of them, as the southern states who wanted to gain more seats had insisted. 3/5 of the slaves, 3/5 of the workers, 3/5 of the people with jobs. Here we go. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included with this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound by service for a term of years, free persons, including those with a job, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all persons. So they'll count them 3/5 of all persons. They'll count the people who were free. They'll count and remind you, persons doesn't mean one human. It could mean one or more. It could mean corporations, this and that, including those bound to service by a term of years. So people with a job. So number of free persons. Persons, remember, persons could mean one or two humans. Corporations, other establishments, including those bound to service for a term of years, people with a job, excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all persons. Says nothing about blacks or African Americans. Not only does the Constitution not mention blacks or whites, but it also doesn't mention slaves or slavery. Throughout the document, slaves are referred to as persons to underscore their humanity. Let's cut to law.com, the legal dictionary. Let's go to natural person, a real human being, as distinguished from a corporation, which is often treated at law as a fictitious person. Now, natural person, we haven't seen that yet. I just thought I should tell you what a human being was distinguished as A natural person, that natural in front of it. So, person, as we've been reading about, what we've seen, that was mentioned in Article 1, Section 2. I think that was what that is. A human being, a corporation treated as having the rights and obligations of a person. Counties and cities can be treated as a person in the same manner as a corporation. However, corporations, counties, and cities cannot have the emotions of humans, such as malice, and therefore are not liable, blah, blah, blah. The Constitution refers to slaves using three different formulations: other persons, such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, and a person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof. They denied constitutional legitimacy to the institution of slavery. Slaveholders could not invoke the supreme law of the land to defend its legitimacy. Reading the original Constitution, a visitor from a foreign land would simply have no way of knowing that race-based slavery existed in America. The Constitution does not explicitly recognize slavery and does not, therefore, admit that slaves were property. Those who want to see what a racist and pro-slavery constitution would look like should turn to the Confederate Constitution of 1861. Let's do that. Constitution of the Confederate States, March 11th, 1861. Let's see. Section 2. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this confederacy according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to servitude for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all slaves. 3/5 of all working people would be taxed. The importation of negroes of the African race from any foreign country other than the slave-holding states or territories in the United States of America is hereby forbidden, and Congress is required to pass such laws as shall effectually prevent the same. Congress shall also have power to prohibit the introduction of slaves from any state not a member of or territory not belonging to this confederacy. Let's return. He was speaking ill of the Confederate Constitution. It is replete, he says, it is replete with references to the institution of Negro slavery. Yeah, he made references to it. Negroes of the African race and Negro slaves. It specifically forbids the Confederate Congress from passing any law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves. The way they're wording this is, I think, disingenuous, because we just read what the Confederate Constitution said regarding Negroes, African race, slavery, and the way they're putting it is to cast a negative or a more negative, or if you want to talk about slavery within the Constitution, you should look at the Confederate Constitution. You know, it's to make one look good and one look bad. Let's shake it. In his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson called the African slave trade an execrable commerce and an affront against human nature itself. The law which President Thomas Jefferson signed, stipulated stiff penalties for any American convicted of participating in the slave trade, up to $10,000 in fines and 5 to 10 years in prison in 1823. A new law was passed that punished slave trading with death. There was one clause in the original Constitution that required cooperation with slaveholders and protected the institution of slavery. Slaves who escaped to freedom were to be delivered up to their masters. The motion to include a fugitive slave clause at the Constitutional Convention passed unanimously and without debate. This would seem to indicate that all knew it would be futile to try to oppose such a measure. The debate instead focused on the wording. Whereas the original draft had referred to a person legally held to service or labor in one state, the final version instead refers to a person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof. Madison explains in his notes, some who thought the term legal equivocal as it gave the impression that slavery was legal in a moral view rather than merely permissible under the law. This is 13 PBS. Slavery and the Making of America. Slavery and the Making of America. The slave experience, legal rights and government. It says the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, the 3/5 clause, ratified 1788, courtesy of National Archives, Charters of Freedom Exhibit. The Constitution did not refer directly to slaves. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution of the United States declared that any person who was not free would be counted as 3/5 of a free individual for the purposes of determining congressional representation. Declared that any person who was not free would be counted as 3/5 of a free individual. That's partial. That's partially what that article says. And it says if you were working, you would be counted as 3/5. It mentioned persons and all that in the article. That any person who was not free, and we know, we just went over what the word person means, okay? Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all persons, of all other persons. Okay, let's move on. This is The Prince, Niccolo Machiavelli, second edition, translated and with an introduction by Harvey C. Mansfield. The Prince by Machiavelli. How cities or principalities which lived by their own laws before they were occupied should be administered. When those states that are acquired, as has been said, are accustomed to living by their own laws and in liberty, there are 3 modes for those who want to hold them. First, ruin them. Second, go there to live personally. Third, let them live by their laws, taking tribute from them and creating within them an oligarchical state which keeps them friendly to you. Taking tribute from them. Tribute meaning taxes. First, ruin them. Second, go there to live personally. Third, let them live by their laws, taking taxes from them and creating within them an oligarchical state, which keeps them friendly to you. And the city, used to living free, may be held more easily by means of its own citizens than in any other mode if one wants to preserve it. For in truth, there is no secure mode to possess them other than to ruin them. In republics, there is greater life, greater hatred, more desire for revenge. The memory of their ancient liberty does not and cannot let them rest, so that the most secure path is to eliminate them or live in them. So you labored, worked, slaved for years in life to open up a diner. And a group of strangers said, you got to serve people who you don't want to serve, people who you don't want in your diner, whether it's because of their complexion, they smell, they walk, they talk. A group of strangers going to force you to serve the people you don't want to serve. Why would I want to eat a slice of pie in a place where I'm not welcome, served by people who don't want me in their establishment? You trust that piece of pie? Why would I want to send my children, flanked by military men, to a school, a place where my children won't be loved all day and will be educated, nurtured, educated slash nurtured slash nourished by complete strangers? These strangers in particular being forced to educate slash nurture slash nourish my children, whose complexion these strangers are offended by. Do the right thing.